The morning mist clung to Ramstein Air Base like a shroud, and Major Kestrel Ghost Valdez knew something was wrong before she even stepped out of her quarters. The silence was too thick, too deliberate. In 18 years of military service, she'd learned to read the spaces between sounds, the pause before artillery fire, the held breath before an ambush, the stillness that preceded chaos. This morning carried that same electric tension, crackling through the autumn air of the German countryside. Her boots clicked against wet concrete as she made her way toward the briefing room, the sound echoing off empty hangars that should have been buzzing with pre-dawn activity. The A-10 Thunderbolts sat motionless in their shelters, their gray hulks looking more like sleeping beasts than instruments of war. Something had changed overnight, and whatever it was, command wasn't talking. The briefing room door stood ajar, spilling harsh fluorescent light into the corridor. Ghost paused, her weathered hand resting on the metal frame as she listened to the voices inside. Colonel Marcus Brennan's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp, dismissive, and laced with the kind of arrogance that made her jaw clench. "I don't care what Washington thinks they know about her record," Brennan was saying, his Boston accent thick with contempt. "This isn't some diversity parade. When the shooting starts, experience matters more than politics." Ghost felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same flame that had carried her through flight school when instructors told her she'd never make it, through 3 combat deployments when fellow pilots whispered she was there to fill quotas, through countless missions where she'd proven herself again and again, only to face the same doubt in new faces. She'd earned her call sign the hard way, not because she disappeared from radar screens, but because she had a way of making enemy fighters vanish from the sky. The conversation inside continued, oblivious to her presence. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Brennan's executive officer, spoke in hushed tones about reassignment possibilities and alternative positions. They were talking about moving her, she realized. After 18 years of service, after leading more successful combat missions than half the pilots in the European theater, they were discussing her future like she was damaged cargo. Ghost stepped into the room, her presence cutting through their whispered conspiracy like a knife through silk. The conversation died instantly. Brennan looked up from his coffee, his pale eyes registering surprise, then annoyance, then something that might have been calculation. He was younger than her by 5 years, a fast-track colonel who'd spent more time in Pentagon corridors than cockpits, and the contempt in his expression was as familiar as her own reflection. "Major Valdez," he said, her name coming out flat and dismissive. "You're early." "Sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing beneath the surface. "I'm always early." The morning mist outside began to lift, revealing the awakening base. But inside the briefing room, the real weather was just beginning to form. Dawn broke across Ramstein with the systematic precision of military routine, but the undercurrents of tension that had begun in the briefing room followed Ghost through her morning inspection. She walked the flight line with practiced eyes, checking each aircraft in her squadron with the methodical attention that had kept her alive through 17 years of combat flying. The A-10s gleamed with morning dew, their distinctive twin engines, and tank-busting cannons ready for whatever mission command would assign. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Reyes, approached with the kind of careful expression that meant he'd heard something. In the military, rumors traveled faster than sound, and bad news moved at light speed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "heard there might be some changes coming down from Wing Command." Ghost continued her inspection, running her hand along the leading edge of her aircraft's wing. The metal was cold, solid, real, unlike the politics swirling around her career. "Changes happen, Sergeant. We adapt." "Yes, ma'am, but—" Reyes hesitated, then forged ahead with the loyalty that made good NCOs invaluable. "The word is Colonel Brennan's got it in for you. Something about restructuring the squadron, maybe moving some pilots to different positions." She'd known this was coming. In 18 years, she'd watched the patterns repeat themselves like a tired script. New commander arrives, looks at personnel files, sees combat decorations and commendations next to a name that doesn't fit their preconceptions, and decides changes need to be made. The fact that she'd never lost a wingman, never failed a mission, never shown anything but absolute professionalism, none of that mattered when politics entered the equation. The morning briefing confirmed her suspicions. Brennan stood at the front of the room, his uniform crisp and his demeanor radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been shot at in anger. Behind him, a PowerPoint slide displayed the new squadron organization chart, and Ghost's name was conspicuously absent from her usual position as flight leader. Effective immediately, Brennan began, his voice carrying across the room with bureaucratic authority, we're implementing new leadership structures to optimize combat effectiveness. He clicked to the next slide, which showed her reassigned to what amounted to a desk job, training coordination and administrative oversight. The room was dead silent. Every pilot in the squadron knew Ghost's record, knew that she'd been flying combat missions since some of them were in high school. The reassignment wasn't just insulting, it was operationally stupid. Captain Torres, one of her former wingmen, raised his hand. Sir, with respect, Major Valdez has more combat experience than. The decision is final, Captain. Brennan cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. Major Valdez will transition to her new role immediately. Captain Morrison will assume leadership of Alpha Flight. Morrison was a capable pilot, but he'd been in-country for 6 months compared to Ghost's 3 years. The other pilots exchanged glances, the kind of look that passed between professionals who recognized bureaucratic insanity when they saw it. After the briefing, Ghost found herself alone in the ready room, staring at her flight suit hanging in its locker. The patches told the story of her career, squadron insignia from 3 different bases, combat mission markers, the silver wings that had taken her 4 years to earn and 18 years to prove she deserved. The silence stretched around her like a challenge, and she realized that Colonel Brennan had just made the biggest mistake of his military career. The afternoon brought the kind of autumn storm that reminded everyone why German weather had a reputation for unpredictability. Rain lashed against the windows of the officers' club as Ghost sat alone at the bar, nursing a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She wasn't much of a drinker, never had been, but the familiar environment of pilots unwinding after duty provided a strange comfort, even when the conversation wasn't about flying. Colonel Brennan entered with the measured stride of someone making a statement, his dress uniform immaculate despite the weather outside. He'd changed from his flight suit, which told Ghost everything she needed to know about his priorities. Real pilots stayed in their gear until the day was done, ready to launch if the mission demanded it. Brennan wore his uniform like armor against the messy realities of military life. He approached the bar with deliberate casualness, ordering a whiskey neat and positioning himself close enough to make conversation inevitable. The handful of other officers in the club seemed to sense the electricity in the air, their conversations becoming more subdued, more attentive. Major, Brennan said, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that preceded bad news, I trust you're adjusting well to your new assignment. Ghost set down her coffee cup with precise control, the kind of movement that came from years of managing high-performance aircraft in high-stress situations. The paperwork is educational, sir. Brennan's smile was thin, predatory. You know Valdez, I've been reviewing your file. Impressive combat record, I'll give you that. But times change. The Air Force is evolving, and sometimes that means reassessing where our assets can be most effective. The word assets hung in the air like a challenge. Ghost had been called many things in her career, but reducing her to inventory was a new low, even for a politician in uniform. Of course, sir, she replied, her voice level, though I have to wonder if the enemy will be impressed by our asset allocation when they're shooting at us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Other conversations stopped entirely as the officers present realized they were witnessing something significant, the kind of confrontation that would be discussed in squadron ready rooms for years to come. Brennan's facade of friendliness cracked slightly. Careful, Major. Insubordination isn't a good look on anyone, especially someone in your position. Ghost stood slowly, her movement controlled and deliberate. At 5'6", she was smaller than Brennan by nearly half a foot, but something in her posture made the size difference irrelevant. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd earned respect through action rather than rank. My position, sir. You mean the position of a combat pilot who's completed more successful missions than most of your staff combined? Or do you mean the position of someone who's apparently too inconvenient for your new command philosophy? The silence in the room was complete now, broken only by the sound of rain against windows and the subtle shift of officers turning to watch. Everyone present understood they were seeing something rare in military circles, a direct challenge to authority based on competence rather than politics. Brennan's face flushed red above his collar, and Ghost realized she'd pushed him exactly where she'd intended to push him. The storm outside intensified, but the real weather was just beginning inside the officers' club. Brennan's composure finally cracked completely. His whiskey glass hit the bar with enough force to slosh amber liquid across the polished wood, and the careful mask of military professionalism fell away to reveal something uglier underneath. You want to know what your real position is, Valdez? His voice rose above the conversational murmur, drawing every eye in the room. You're a relic, a diversity hire who's been coasting on old glory and political protection. The new Air Force doesn't have room for pilots who think their vagina gives them special privileges. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb sound itself. Ghost felt the familiar fire ignite in her chest, but her voice remained steady, controlled, professional. Sir, I think you might want to reconsider. No, I think you need to understand something. Brennan stepped closer, his finger jabbing toward her face. You've been getting away with attitude for years because nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork. But I'm not afraid of making hard decisions. You can adapt to your new role, or you can find yourself facing a fitness for duty review that will end your career. Ghost's hands remained relaxed at her sides, but every pilot in the room recognized the stillness that preceded action. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd faced enemy fire and found it less intimidating than bureaucratic bullying. Colonel, you're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was not reassigning you sooner. Brennan's face was fully flushed now, his carefully maintained image completely abandoned. You think because you've got some combat missions under your belt, you're untouchable. Let me explain how the real world works. What happened next would be debated in officer clubs and squadron-ready rooms for years to come. According to some witnesses, Brennan moved first, his hand reaching out toward Ghost in what could have been construed as either a threatening gesture or an attempt to physically intimidate her. According to others, it was clearly an attempt to grab her shoulder, to physically emphasize his authority. What everyone agreed on was what happened after. Ghost's response was instantaneous and utterly professional. Her left hand intercepted Brennan's wrist with surgical precision, while her right hand found the pressure point at his elbow. The movement was so smooth, so economical, that it took a full second for the witnesses to understand what they were seeing. Brennan's arm bent at an unnatural angle, and the sound that emerged from his throat was something between a gasp and a scream. He dropped to one knee instantly, his face going white with shock and pain. Sir, Ghost said, her voice completely calm, I served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've been shot at by people who wanted to kill me, not just reassign me. This conversation is over. She released his arm and stepped back, her posture returning to the relaxed attention that was second nature after 18 years of service. Brennan remained on one knee, cradling his arm and struggling to process what had just happened. The silence stretched until Captain Torres found his voice. "Should I call the medics, sir?" Ghost looked around the room at the assembled officers, pilots, navigators, intelligence specialists, support staff, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed admiration. She'd just done something that would either end her career or define it. "That won't be necessary," she said quietly. "The colonel just needs a moment to reconsider his approach to personnel management." Outside, lightning illuminated the base, but inside the officers' club, everyone understood they'd witnessed something that would change everything. The base hospital's emergency room had seen its share of training accidents, equipment failures, and the occasional altercation between personnel, but Colonel Brennan's injury presented a unique challenge for the medical staff. How do you document that a full colonel's arm was dislocated by a major who was defending herself against what could generously be called aggressive leadership techniques? Dr. Captain Sarah Martinez, the attending physician, had known Ghost for 2 years and had patched up enough pilots to recognize the difference between accidents and intentional actions. As she worked on Brennan's arm, her questions were professionally neutral but pointed. "So this happened during a discussion about squadron assignments?" she asked, manipulating Brennan's elbow back into proper alignment with practiced efficiency. Brennan's face was pale with pain and something that might have been embarrassment. "It was a training demonstration that got out of hand," he said through gritted teeth, apparently having decided that the truth would be more damaging to his career than a lie. Ghost sat in the waiting area, having insisted on accompanying Brennan to the hospital despite his protests. Her personnel file was already thick with commendations for leadership under fire, but tonight had added something new, a reputation for not backing down when pushed beyond reason. The story spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By the time the evening shift change occurred, every enlisted person and officer at Ramstein had heard some version of what happened in the officers' club. The details varied depending on the source, but the core facts remained consistent. Colonel Brennan had physically threatened Major Valdez, and she had responded with exactly the kind of measured force that her combat training had taught her. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, the senior enlisted advisor for the wing, found Ghost in the hospital waiting room. His weathered face carried the kind of expression that suggested he'd been dealing with officer politics longer than he cared to remember. "Ma'am," he said, settling into the chair beside her with the careful movements of someone whose knees had seen too many years of military service. "Heard there was some excitement at the club tonight." Ghost looked at him with the wariness of someone who'd learned to read between the lines of military conversation. "Just a misunderstanding, Sergeant Major. Nothing that couldn't be resolved professionally." Rodriguez's smile was brief but genuine. "Professionally, that's one word for it." He leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping to the confidential tone that senior NCOs used when sharing institutional wisdom. "You know, ma'am, in 32 years of service, I've seen a lot of commanders come and go. Some of them understand that leadership is about earning respect. Others think it comes automatically with the rank." The implication was clear, but Ghost had learned long ago to be careful about criticizing superior officers, even to sympathetic audiences. Every commander has their own style, Sergeant Major. "True enough," Rodriguez agreed. "But some styles work better than others when bullets start flying. The enlisted folks have been talking, ma'am. They know who's been leading from the front and who's been leading from behind a desk." Before Ghost could respond, Dr. Martinez emerged from the treatment room, stripping off her gloves with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd finished a routine procedure. She nodded to Ghost, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes holding a spark of something that might have been approval. "Colonel Brennan is ready to be discharged," she announced. "Minor dislocation, no permanent damage. He'll need to keep the arm in a sling for a few days, but full recovery is expected." Brennan emerged from the treatment room with his left arm secured against his chest, his face a careful mask of controlled anger. He looked at Ghost with the kind of expression that promised future consequences, but when he spoke, his voice was level. "Major Valdez, report to my office at 800 tomorrow. We need to discuss your future with this squadron." Ghost stood and came to attention with the precise movements that had become automatic after 18 years. "Yes, sir." As Brennan left the hospital, Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "Some people never learn, ma'am. They mistake fear for respect and think that's how you build a fighting unit." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear, but Ghost suspected the real weather was just getting started. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed severe storms, as if the air itself had been washed clean of impurities. Ghost stood outside Colonel Brennan's office at precisely 7:55, her uniform immaculate and her bearing reflecting 18 years of military discipline. The receptionist, a young airman whose nervous glances suggested he'd heard about the previous evening's events, avoided eye contact as she announced her arrival. Through the thin walls of the administrative building, Ghost could hear Brennan's voice on the phone, the tone clipped and angry. He was talking to someone with more rank, explaining the situation in terms that undoubtedly painted her as the aggressor. She'd expected this, had planned for it, actually. In her years of service, she'd learned that bureaucratic retaliation was often more dangerous than enemy fire. At exactly 800, the door opened and Brennan gestured her inside. His left arm was still in a sling, a visible reminder of the previous evening's confrontation, and his expression carried the kind of cold fury that came from someone whose authority had been publicly challenged. "Sit down, Major," he said, moving carefully around his desk. The formal tone told Ghost everything she needed to know about the direction this conversation would take. She remained standing at attention. "I prefer to stand, sir." Brennan's jaw tightened, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he opened a folder on his desk, her personnel file, she realized, thick with 18 years of fitness reports, commendations, and mission records. "I've been on the phone with Wing Command this morning," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone delivering prepared remarks. "Last night's incident has raised serious concerns about your fitness for duty and your ability to maintain proper military bearing." Ghost kept her expression neutral, but internally she was calculating options. A fitness for duty review could end her career, regardless of her combat record. The military had ways of removing problem personnel that were both legally bulletproof and professionally devastating. "Sir, I was defending myself against what I perceived as a physical threat. My response was measured and appropriate to the situation." Brennan's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Your perception, Major, is irrelevant. What matters is that you physically assaulted a superior officer in front of witnesses. That's a court-martial offense." The silence stretched between them like a bridge over dangerous water. Ghost had faced this moment before, in different forms. The moment when institutional politics collided with professional competence, and only one could survive. "However," Brennan continued, clearly savoring what he believed was his moment of victory, "I'm prepared to be reasonable. You can request a transfer to a non-flying position, perhaps something in training, command, or logistics, and we can characterize last night as a misunderstanding. Your record remains clean, and you can finish out your career in a role more suitable to your temperament." Ghost felt the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same flame that had carried her through flight school, through combat missions, through 18 years of proving herself again and again. But this time, the fire burned cold and steady, like the exhaust from a perfectly tuned jet engine. "Sir, I respectfully decline your offer." Brennan blinked, clearly not having expected that response. "Excuse me." "I said I declined, sir. I'm a combat pilot. I've been a combat pilot for 18 years, and I intend to remain a combat pilot until the Air Force decides I'm no longer qualified or I decide to retire." Ghost's voice remained level, professional, but it carried an undertone of absolute certainty that made Brennan shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Then you're making a serious mistake, Major. I can make your life very difficult." Ghost nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, I'm sure you can. But you should know that I've made copies of my complete service record, including fitness reports, mission summaries, and commendations from 3 different combat zones. I've also documented our conversation last night, including witness statements from everyone present." The color drained from Brennan's face as he realized the implications. A court-martial would require a full investigation, and investigations had a way of revealing uncomfortable truths about command decisions and personnel management. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher into the German sky, but inside the colonel's office, the real battle was just beginning. Brennan's office fell silent except for the distant hum of base operations, aircraft engines warming up, ground crews conducting pre-flight checks, the steady rhythm of military life that continued regardless of personal conflicts between officers. Ghost watched as the colonel processed the implications of her statement, his political calculations almost visible behind his eyes. "You're threatening me, Major," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "No, sir. I'm explaining that I've documented my actions and preserved evidence. That's standard procedure when facing potential disciplinary action. I learned it in a leadership course that emphasized the importance of protecting both subordinates and the institution from false accusations." The reference to leadership was deliberately pointed, and both officers understood the subtext. Brennan had tried to use his rank as a weapon, but Ghost had just demonstrated that she understood the bureaucratic battlefield better than he'd anticipated. Brennan opened her personnel file and began reading, his expression growing more frustrated with each page. 18 years of superior fitness reports, combat decorations, commendations from commanders who'd actually flown missions with her, letters of appreciation from Allied forces. The record painted a picture of exactly the kind of officer the Air Force claimed to value. "Your record is impressive, I'll give you that," he admitted grudgingly. "But records don't tell the whole story. Leadership is about more than flying ability and combat experience. It's about knowing your place in the chain of command." Ghost's response was measured, professional, and devastating in its simplicity. "Sir, I've never questioned the chain of command. I've questioned judgment calls that put aircrew at risk or compromise mission effectiveness. There's a difference." The phone on Brennan's desk rang, interrupting the conversation. He answered with barely concealed irritation, his voice shifting to the deferential tone he reserved for superior officers. "Yes, sir. No, sir, the situation is under control, I understand. Yes, sir, she's here now." He hung up and looked at Ghost with an expression that mixed anger with something that might have been uncertainty. "That was General Morrison. He wants to see both of us in his office at 1100. Ghost felt a familiar flutter of tension, not fear exactly, but the heightened awareness that came before any significant engagement. General Morrison was a pilot's pilot, someone who'd earned his stars in cockpits rather than conference rooms. His involvement could change everything. "Sir, should I prepare any specific materials for the meeting?" Brennan's laugh was bitter. "Just bring your documentation, Major. Apparently, word of last night's events has reached higher levels than I anticipated." For the next 2 hours, Ghost went through the motions of her assigned duties, reviewing training schedules, updating flight records, the administrative tasks that kept squadrons functioning but bore no resemblance to the flying that had defined her career. But her mind was focused on the upcoming meeting and the possibilities it represented. At 10:50, she found herself walking across the base toward wing headquarters, her dress uniform crisp in the autumn morning. Other personnel she passed offered subtle nods of acknowledgement, not quite support, but recognition that something significant was happening. Brennan was already waiting in the general's outer office when she arrived, his arm still in its sling and his expression carefully neutral. They sat in silence, two officers who discovered they were fundamentally incompatible, waiting for someone with more authority to resolve their conflict. At exactly 1100, General Morrison's aide announced that he was ready to see them. Ghost stood and straightened her uniform, preparing for what might be the most important conversation of her military career. Through the office window, she could see aircraft taking off from the runway, climbing into the clear German sky with the purposeful grace that had first drawn her to flying 18 years ago. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine whether she'd ever join them again. General Morrison's office reflected the sensibilities of someone who'd spent more time in cockpits than behind desks. Aviation art covered the walls, paintings of F-16s in combat formations, photographs of historic aircraft, a collection of squadron patches that told the story of a career built on flying rather than politics. His desk was functional rather than imposing, and when he gestured for them to sit, his manner suggested someone more interested in facts than ceremony. Morrison was younger than Ghost had expected for a general officer, probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of weathered features that came from years of high-altitude flying. His flight suit hung on a hook behind his desk, suggesting he'd been flying earlier that morning, a detail that immediately raised him in Ghost's estimation. "Colonel Brennan, Major Valdez," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "I've received several interesting phone calls since last night, and I want to understand exactly what happened before this situation escalates further." Brennan straightened in his chair, his politician's instincts engaging. "Sir, Major Valdez physically assaulted me during what should have been a routine discussion about squadron reorganization. Her actions were unprofessional and potentially criminal." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted to Ghost. "Major, your perspective." Ghost had rehearsed this moment during her sleepless night, knowing that her career might depend on how she presented her case. "Sir, Colonel Brennan made physical contact with me during a heated discussion. I responded with minimum necessary force to defend myself and de-escalate the situation." "Minimum necessary force," Morrison repeated, his tone neutral. "That's an interesting phrase. What's your background in defensive tactics, Major?" "Sir, I'm certified as a combatives instructor and have maintained proficiency in defensive techniques throughout my career. It's standard training for aircrew who might face capture in hostile territory." Morrison nodded slowly, then opened a folder on his desk. "I've been reviewing both of your service records. Colonel Brennan, you have an impressive administrative background and strong performance reviews from your staff positions. Major Valdez, you have 17 years of combat flying experience, including 3 deployments and a remarkable mission success rate." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Morrison was laying out the fundamental tension between bureaucratic leadership and operational competence, and everyone in the room understood it. "Here's what I'm struggling with," Morrison continued, leaning back in his chair. "I have a squadron that's been performing exceptionally well under its current leadership structure. Combat readiness is high, morale is strong, and mission effectiveness is above theater average. Now I'm being asked to believe that the officer most responsible for that success is somehow unfit for duty." Brennan's face flushed slightly. "Sir, with respect, military effectiveness isn't just about combat performance. It's about discipline, chain of command, and proper military bearing." Morrison's smile was thin. "Colonel, I flew combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when bureaucrats prioritize form over function. Good pilots die, missions fail, and the enemy wins." He turned to Ghost. "Major, what's your assessment of squadron readiness under the new leadership structure?" Ghost chose her words carefully. "Sir, the pilots are professional and will adapt to any command structure. However, There are concerns about operational decision-making and the prioritization of administrative requirements over flight training. It was a diplomatic way of saying that Brennan was destroying a functional unit through incompetent leadership, and Morrison clearly understood the subtext. "Gentlemen and lady, here's what's going to happen," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made harder decisions under more dangerous circumstances. "This situation stops here. No charges, no fitness reviews, no transfers unless requested by the individuals involved." Brennan started to protest, but Morrison cut him off with a look that had probably been effective at 30,000 feet under enemy fire. "However, I'm implementing some changes to ensure this kind of incident doesn't happen again." Ghost felt her stomach tighten, wondering if Morrison's solution would simply be a more elegant form of the same bureaucratic exile Brennan had threatened. Outside the office windows, another flight of A-10s lifted off into the clear morning sky, their twin engines trailing exhaust as they climbed toward the training ranges. The sight reminded Ghost why she joined the Air Force in the first place, not for politics or career advancement, but for the pure challenge of mastering machines that could dance with death and bring their pilots home safely. Morrison's next words would determine whether she'd ever join them again. General Morrison stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the A-10s disappear into the distance. When he turned back to face them, his expression carried the weight of command decisions that balanced institutional politics with operational necessity. "Colonel Brennan, you're being reassigned to Pentagon staff effective immediately. There's an opening in acquisition planning that will make good use of your administrative skills." Morrison's tone was matter-of-fact, but the reassignment was clearly not optional. "Major Valdez, you'll assume command of the squadron until we can identify a permanent replacement." The silence in the room was deafening. Ghost felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of military politics. She'd expected punishment or exile, not promotion. Brennan's face went through several shades of red before settling on something approaching purple. "Sir, with respect," Brennan began, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "this sets a dangerous precedent. If subordinates can physically assault superior officers and be rewarded." Morrison's interruption was sharp and final. "Colonel, you're dismissed. Your replacement orders will be ready by 1400. I suggest you use the time to conduct a proper change of command brief with Major Valdez." Brennan stood stiffly, his injured arm making the movement awkward. He looked at Ghost with an expression that promised future consequences, then rendered a precise salute to Morrison before leaving the office without another word. Morrison waited until the door closed before returning to his desk. "Major, you look surprised." Ghost was still processing the sudden reversal of fortune. "Sir, I expected this meeting to end my career, not advance it." "Leadership isn't about rank, Major. It's about results. Your squadron has the highest mission success rate in the European theater, the lowest accident rate, and consistently receives the highest marks for aircrew proficiency. That doesn't happen by accident." Morrison opened another folder, this one thicker and marked with classification stamps. "I've been watching this situation develop for months. Colonel Brennan was brought in to modernize squadron operations, which apparently meant replacing experienced combat leaders with officers who looked better on promotion boards." The general's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd fought similar battles throughout his career. "The problem with that approach is that it confuses political correctness with military effectiveness. When bullets start flying, pilots don't care about their commander's staff college grades. They care about whether their leader can bring them home alive." Ghost felt a familiar mixture of pride and wariness. "Sir, assuming command of the squadron is a significant responsibility. Some of the pilots have been questioning the recent changes, and restoring unit cohesion will take time." Morrison's smile was genuine for the first time since the meeting began. Major, you've been effectively leading that squadron for months while Brennan focused on reorganization charts and efficiency reports. The only thing that's changing is the paperwork. The phone on Morrison's desk buzzed, and his aide's voice announced that his next appointment was waiting. The general stood, signaling the end of their meeting. One more thing, Major. I'm recommending you for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel. Your combat record and leadership ability deserve recognition, and the timing sends a clear message about what this command values. Ghost came to attention, her mind still reeling from the rapid succession of life-changing announcements. Sir, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just keep doing what you've been doing, leading by example and putting mission accomplishment ahead of personal politics. Morrison extended his hand, and Ghost shook it with the firm grip of someone who understood that handshakes between pilots carried weight beyond social convention. As she left the general's office, Ghost found herself walking through the base with a different perspective. The same buildings, the same aircraft, the same personnel, but everything had changed in the space of an hour. She was no longer the underestimated female pilot fighting for acceptance. She was the squadron commander, responsible for the lives and careers of 43 aircrew and over 200 support personnel. The magnitude of the responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. But as she approached the squadron building, Ghost realized she'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. The squadron building buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that followed major command changes. Word of Brennan's reassignment and Ghost's promotion had spread through the base communications network faster than official channels could manage, and every member of the unit was trying to understand what the changes meant for their daily operations. Ghost found the squadron's senior NCO, Master Sergeant Patricia Kowalski, waiting in her office. Kowalski had been with the unit for 6 years and possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that kept squadrons functioning regardless of officer politics. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Ghost detected a hint of satisfaction in her demeanor. "Ma'am, congratulations on the promotion," Kowalski said, her voice carrying the careful respect that senior enlisted personnel reserved for officers they decided were competent. "The troops are asking questions about what changes to expect." Ghost settled behind her desk now, she realized, and looked at the organizational charts and efficiency reports that Brennan had left scattered across its surface. The paperwork represented his vision of squadron management, color-coded matrices, statistical analyses, and flowcharts that reduced human beings to data points. "Sergeant Kowalski,"